Today on Bumbling Through Dungeons, to invert the words of my boy Mark Antony, I come not to bury cliches, but to praise them. So if you're like me and you exist in the year 2019, you're probably not a huge fan of cliches and tropes. If you follow any sort of media genre, movies, TV, books, video games, and yes, role-playing games, the idea of cliches and tropes gets somewhat of a bad rep. Now, I'm not here to dispute a lot of the bad uses of cliche in popular media, but I am here to defend its use occasionally in role-playing games when it has a particular purpose. And we're going to talk about some of those purposes that it can serve that are useful today. I think the first and one of the most important points to remember as it comes to using cliches in your D&D game is that every group and every player is really in a different place. So if you have a group of gaming diehards who's been at it for 30 years and you've played through multiple editions, you've probably seen every variation on classic D&D tropes that exists within the canon. And you've probably seen a lot of variations on those too that are meant to try to spice things up and make it unique. So your threshold for something that's surprising is going to be a lot higher than for someone who's just entering the game. In contrast, for newer players, a lot of times they'll get into it because they enjoy the conventions of the genre. And so sort of leaning into a lot of the expected tropes and formulas of fantasy worlds and role-playing worlds is actually going to be very comfortable to them. It's going to be something that allows them to engage with the world more readily than if it was something that they were unfamiliar with, a setting or a world or a type of style of gaming maybe that they're unfamiliar with. So nothing that I say here today is going to be true across the board for every DM, for every player, and for every group. I think you need to know the context of your group. Everything is contextual, and context is always key with these sorts of matters. So what kind of cliches do I think can be used well, or at least aren't as bad as sometimes they get a reputation for? Well, one of the most obvious ones is starting your adventure out in a bar or tavern. This is a well-worn D&D trope. And a lot of adventures to this day start inside a bar or tavern, to the point where if you start your adventure in a bar or tavern, you're going to get a lot of eye rolls from longtime players. I think it's important to remember that no session or adventure or campaign is going to be made or broken on one scene. And it's not going to make or break you to start it in a place that is easy. You know, there's a reason so many adventures start in a tavern. It's a real easy place to get to know the players, interact with some NPCs, get a quest, and then go off and do that quest. It's not going to be the most original thing that you do in your campaign, but then it doesn't have to be. So a lot of times when you're starting off a campaign, the important thing is just to get it going in the right direction, and the most exciting bits are going to come later on. That said, if you do have a really interesting way to start your campaign that has nothing to do with starting it in a tavern, that's great too. But I have seen DMs sort of bend over backwards trying to come up with a really inventive, clever, different way to start their session or campaign, and it ends up feeling forced, and it ends up sort of railroading the session into something that the DM doesn't want. A perfect example of this was the first campaign I ever ran. I think I referenced it in an earlier video, but I basically did a D&D variation on the movie The Hangover. And I basically told the players, like, you had a hard night of drinking, some crazy things happened, you wake up in a random place, it was just a room, like a storehouse, and they have to figure out what happened the night before. This premise was really interesting to me, and I think it played out okay at the table, but to a certain extent, it took agency away from the players, because I was telling them, this is where you start, this is what happened the night before, figure it out. So they did have a lot of fun with it, but at the same time, I didn't give them much choice out of the gates. So starting it in a more neutral setting, and yes, you could say a more mundane setting like a tavern, can oftentimes give your players a little bit more choice, a little bit more agency to pick their own route rather than being thrust into the middle of an adventure somewhere. And again, you can find counterexamples to the counterexamples with all of this. I've seen some really fun, interesting ways to start sessions and start entire campaigns where you get dropped right into the middle of the action and you're further away from a tavern than you could possibly be. And that's cool too. All of it is in the execution, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with starting it in a mundane location. Another thing that I see some players maybe not roll their eyes at, but try to find variations on is sort of these racial qualities, whether it's elves and dwarves and humans and gnomes and halflings. They all have certain characteristics and tendencies that we all understand from fantasy literature and fantasy movies. So elves are either in the forest or they're somewhat aloof off in their ivory towers. Dwarves are rough and tumble and they probably have some Scottish accent and they're hard drinking and they're in mountainous regions or maybe cavernous regions. And we all sort of understand that as the Dwarven Society. A lot of DMs try to turn this on its head and create elvish or dwarven or any race societies that are very different from these expectations. And that can be really cool if you're sinking your teeth into a civilization or a particular location that is very different from what your players' expectations are going to be. That can be really cool discovering what those differences are. But in a lot of my campaigns, what I've found is the players might end up in a dwarven settlement or an elven village, and that isn't the focal point. The dwarves are a means to an end. The players might be stopping at a particular kingdom or town or city or settlement or whatever it is, but they're not going to spend too much time there. They're not going to sink their teeth into this location and get to know all the NPCs. So why would I reinvent the wheel with Dwarven Society or Elvish Society? And I'm using these two as probably the most well-known examples from among fantasy. But again, you could take this in any direction you want and use these as examples for any race or region within fantasy literature. So in a campaign that I ran, they had a Dwarven NPC ally with them for a number of sessions, and they got a quest from the Dwarven King. And they were in the Dwarven stronghold, and it was an underground stronghold, and they were forgers and miners, and everything that you might expect from typical fantasy Dwarven society. But I didn't want to spend a ton of time working up an entirely different Dwarven society. If I was setting a campaign and a number of the players were themselves dwarves, or I was going to set more of the campaign and more of the plot hooks in and around the Dwarven civilization, I would probably give them some quirks to separate it from what my players expect, so that it's not just familiar to them, that there are some aspects that they don't expect. But in my campaign, there's so much of this that's just a means to an end. You have your narrative, you have your characters and their arcs and things going on with them, and a lot of the things that you're throwing at them, from NPCs to locations that they're going to certain plot hooks, a lot of these are means to other ends within the narrative, within your master plot, whatever that may be. And if you get lost in the weeds trying to reinvent the wheel here, I think you're doing yourself a disservice and really doing your players a disservice, because you're taking time away from focusing on the more central narrative elements of the campaign. And again, just to provide a counterexample, probably my favorite alternative D&D setting is Dark Sun, which does exactly what I just said. I don't like to do that often, and it takes each of these races that we think we're familiar with from the fantasy canon going back decades, and it inverts them and it changes them and it warps them until you have a completely different feel to the world, and you really don't know what to expect when you encounter someone of a particular race or region. And I think one of the reasons Dark Sun works really well as an alternate campaign setting is because it takes so much time fleshing out these different societies and how they work, and how the races and classes are these warped inversions that have been warped by this different world. And it creates a very unique experience, and it's one that I like, but it's also one that takes a lot of time to build that. So if you're not willing to put in all that work, or if you think that level of work is going to detract from the story that you guys are building together at the table, that's when I think it's okay to lean in on sort of the expected. So I'm trying to provide a lot of counterexamples of how you can do these things well both ways, but I'm trying to create 2 points. One is that you should keep the focus on the players. And if you're spending too much time trying to invert cliches and tropes and what your players expect, if you're putting too much work into that, you might be neglecting other areas of the campaign that will reap more benefits in the long term. And the second takeaway or moral of the story, I hope, is that it's not to avoid innovation. I think some of the coolest, most innovative things I've seen in D&D and in D&D adventures are when people take something that you think you know and turn it into something that's wildly unexpected and surprising, and that creates some wonderful moments at the table. Do that when you have those cool ideas, but don't feel that you need to. So whether your players are trying to save the goodly princess from the evil dragon or save the goodly dragon from the evil princess, I hope you're able to use the full range of options available to you, both within and without the cliches of the fantasy genre. Good luck, have fun, and I will see you next time.